Hello, good afternoon. This is our now regular stay-at-home festival Sunday Science Q&A, and today we are joined by Adam Rutherford. Most recently, his most recent book was How to Argue with a Racist, which is an interesting book, which has led to him getting a lot of interesting letters with fonts in many, many imaginative colours, and also the Book of Humans. And for the person who asked, no, I promise I won't ask about the behaviour of otters. If you haven't read it yet, you'll know why I'm not asking about the behaviour of otters on a show which may well have children watching as well. There's very, very simple reasons. We're also joined by Lucy Cooke, who I think I'm right in saying her first book, I hope I'm right in saying that, The Truth About Animals. I think that was, which is, again, a wonderful book which takes us into so many different areas about other species that are not always the things that we see when we're watching kind of primetime TV documentaries about animal behaviour. And we're also joined, as usual, by Helen Czerski, who is author of Storm in a Teacup, and another book that, like everyone else, she's working on at the moment, and realising we might have much further to our deadline than we used to have. I've just quickly mentioned a couple of things. One is the tip jar at the bottom. We're trying to keep this free access for everyone. We're making between normally 9 and 11 shows a week. We want it to be free access, but if possible, if you do have some spare cash and you are able to put money in the tip jar, that means we can not merely keep making these, but also we're using this as a fund for various people in the arts who are currently finding it very, very difficult, and also for the arts centres, which are quite often a social hub as well as a place for entertainment. And we've been giving donations to various arts centres around the UK to hopefully keep them running for when we are allowed to go back and watch our evenings of free jazz, Berkoff plays and other such things. I don't know if that really sold it to you by suggesting there'll be more free jazz if you keep supporting us. There will be other forms of music as well. And on top of that, I've just mentioned next week we've got a slight change in time. On Monday, Thursday and Friday we're out at 10:30 in the morning, and on Tuesday and Wednesday it's going to be 10 o'clock, and our guests are going to include Bruce Hood, Maeve Higgins and Claudia O'Doherty, which I'm very excited about. Their film Extraordinary is absolutely fantastic. We're going to have Andy Zaltzman and Helen Zaltzman together as well, Francesca Stavrokopoulou, lots of other stuff. Also, by the way, other things is you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you can also subscribe to us via Patreon, because Patreon, we are still making other non-isolation based shows as well. So there we go. I think that's everything Trent told me. Let's have a look. Yep, that's fine. So let's now start the show with Helen Czerski, her show and tell. And for those of you who watch regularly, we always ask people if they've got... And the nice thing is sometimes I forget to tell them in advance. And so it means that their show and tell will be whatever is on the nearest shelf to them as they're sat there. But Helen, you know we always do a show and tell.
So now this is quite hard to see. This is a little bit of rock, and this is genuine Lapis lazuli, which is was one of the most famous bright blue pigments. So back in the Renaissance, the pigment that came from this genuinely bright blue rock, I apologise, it's quite hard to see because it's very dramatic, was more expensive than gold. And people used to measure their worth by, they weren't in the art that was painted. The more of this blue you had, the richer you were. So it's super cool. And it comes from a very limited number of places. There's a valley in Afghanistan, and they used to say, the locals, that it was like the sky was flowing out in a river, because bits of this rock used to come out on the river. So that is all very exciting. Lapis lazuli being a very expensive, very rare colour. And the colour itself comes from a combination of sulfur atoms. And the brilliant thing is, of course, the chemists came along and spoilt all the fun by making those sulfur, that little compound, that pattern of molecules, really easy. And then ultramarine became cheap. And I had just discovered literally an hour ago that I have genuine artificial ultramarine in a little box. I've got some acrylic paint. So everybody basically has ultramarine now. But so ultramarine is the colour that lapis lazuli was turned into. And just finally, the best thing that goes with it is that after a bit more reading this lunchtime, I discovered that ultramarine, what was originally the very most expensive pigment in the world, was used in blue rinse. So those of you that remember pictures of older women in the 30s onwards who had faintly purple hair, that was blue rinse, because if you add a bit of blue, it stops stuff looking quite as yellow. And so the most expensive pigment in the world became in its modern version, blue rinse, which is just brilliant. So that's
this is, of course, as we know, why many of us, when our grandparents died, we would immediately shave their heads and take that down to the pawnbrokers, knowing that we had blue gold there. Can I just see that again? Could you just put that right up to your camera, because that is such a beautiful thing. I don't know how close you can get.
Let me see it. The problem is that the way this is set up, maybe you can see there the colour.
Yeah.
Right in close there. It's that colour. And I've painted a bit of my blue acrylic, so that might be a bit easier to see. That's my blue acrylic paint that I fished out. So that's the actual colour when it's not hidden in the rock. And the rock itself has it's got these white and yellow stripes in it that are lots of different compounds. So it isn't just a single mineral, it's a mixture of lots of things together. But I was so excited. We went to see an artist. The reason I have this isn't because I stole it from Afghanistan. It's because we went to see an artist who restores old paintings, and he genuinely grinds this up to fill in the gaps on old paintings. And I was clearly like a little excited puppy about this colour. I hate beige and grey. I will make anything I buy will be the brightest colour available. And he saw that I kept looking at it, and he gave me a bit. So I was very grateful.
I love that thing that I forget what the BBC show's called, which is where they find out whether a painting is an authentic work by. So, I don't know if you've ever seen it. There was like a William Blake that they were looking at, a possible William Blake, and finding the process of, well, this colour is exactly what would have been used at that particular time. This is what would have been ground up. This is the beeswax that would have been used. I know we've also got a question from the live chat as well. Trent, what someone wants to know something extra from Helen there. So if you can just tell us what that is, pop up on the live chat. I wish to know, Lazuli is also a rather excellent French prog rock band. So there we are. So we've moved from free jazz to prog. So much hope already in the first.
We're going to have hip hop later because Adam cannot shut up about it.
Yeah, I know. And he's reached an age where it gets increasingly embarrassing. Lucy, now, one thing that your journey into making the wonderful programs that you've made about all manner of species, and including the particularly voracious seagulls that you dealt with. But that journey kind of starts with a fascination with frogs, doesn't it?
Yeah, look, I've got my favourite sweatshirt on. Somebody just gave this to me. It's got a frog on it. So yeah, no, I do. I really like frogs. It's really true. Yeah, I know. I went off. I was trying to make a documentary about the amphibian extinction crisis, which strangely enough nobody was interested in, and I called myself the I froze. That's going to happen. But yeah, so yeah, no, I love frogs, and it all started with a blog where I was the amphibian avenger, trying to tell people why they should love frogs.
Now, is your show and tell on your lap, or is there a secondary show and tell as well?
No, this is Kobe. This is my very much my best friend these days. But I've got, and hopefully he won't try and eat it, I've got to show vulture's feather, which I picked up in South Africa, and it belongs to a Cape vulture. And I was doing some filming there. Cape vultures are endangered, partly because of the fact that local custom is that if you smoke vulture brains, then you can see into the future, because vultures have are credited with having amazing eyesight. So there's this idea that you can have clear sight, you can see into the future if you smoke vulture brains. And when the lotto arrived in South Africa, suddenly vultures started being killed in large numbers for their vulture brains, which nobody ever sort of really thinks that the lotto could be a conservation issue, but it turns out that it can. Anyway, so I was there with this conservationist who's trying to protect the vultures, and I managed to swipe this feather. But one of the kind of interesting things about vultures is that people don't really like them very much. They think they're unclean, but in actual fact, they're the complete opposite. They don't get sick when they eat things that would kill most of us. And that's because they have stomach acids that are very, very strong indeed. And in fact, the woman who's trying to save them, Kerry Volter, told me that if I wanted to, I could clean my dishes or use as a hand sanitizer vulture poop. So there we go. I know that hand sanitizer is very hard to come by, but if you're near a vulture, or a vulture, then their crap will do just as well.
And that is how the zoo break-in
occurred.
This is Adam. Now you have you got a show and tell? Did I warn you? Hopefully you managed to get my email as well. That was a beautiful feather, by the way. That really wonderful.
Well, I didn't actually get the email, but in the preamble to introducing this program, you said the show and tell could be something off the shelf yourself. So I literally have done that. My show and tell, because I haven't got to do any Skype interviews so far, and everyone sort of on Twitter is perving over shelfies. So I thought if you can just see behind my ear there, I collect first editions. Did you make a noise then?
I know you're going to show a Darwin, aren't you? That I'm going to have an awful amount of envy, even avarice about.
These are my 19th century first or rare editions. So there's the Malay Archipelago by Wallace, the Naturalist of the Amazon by Bates. There's an Origin of Species, which is the 5th edition. And then this is the one that I know that you're going to get really excited about, Robin. That is a first edition of Vegetable Mold and Earthworms by Darwin. Strangely, his least popular of the main body of work of his books. And then there's a first edition of the Everyman version of The Voyage of the Beagle. And then down this end, just to complete the set, we've got a first edition of the Double Helix by the and the two biographies by Crick and Watson, What Mad Pursuit by Crick, and the Double Helix by James Watson, who is still alive and still a racist. So that's my show and tell. Is my rare books. There you go.
It is because I've worked very hard to try and make sure the formation of vegetable mold through the action of worms with observation on the habits becomes more popular. Because I read out from it for about a whole year. Every night I would find excuse, and it is such a beautiful book about curiosity because it's Darwin's final book. It's the last, and it is him and his son, the curiosity over the actions of earthworms. And I think there's a real delight in that book.
Absolutely, and it's got some of the best stories, some of the best research, or the most fun research that went in. The very famous one, which you can still see the artifacts of at Down House, although it's now closed, of course, is that Charles Darwin asked his son William, I think it was, to play his bassoon. He was a talented young bassoon player, and he got his bassoon and got some earthworms and put them on top of the piano and played the bassoon to the earthworms in order to test the idea that they could hear or that they would react to strong vibrations, audio vibrations. And as is not publicized enough in contemporary science, it was a negative result. But that made it into this astonishing book. Interestingly, it's not his least cited book. His least cited book is on the emotions of animals and man. And we've been writing about this recently for the next book, the one that I'm doing with Hannah Fry, because we think that as in the 20th century, researchers and behavioral specialists began to sort of try and scienceify the study of emotions in animals more than Darwin had done. And so they moved, there's a big swing away from accepting even the basic idea that animals could experience joy or unhappiness or various emotions. And Darwin had written extensively about that stuff, and we're beginning to move back towards that at the end of the 20th, beginning of the 21st century. I mean, I think it's an interesting example of the sociology of science, how we're not very good at trying to understand the behaviors of creatures because we tend to anthropomorphize them very easily. And you only have to look at Lucy's image to see what a lovely, cute, happy dog there is right there.
That's interesting because there's a very good volume of the expression of emotion in animals. I forget, it's a guy who actually worked with, I think Sophie Scott worked with him, who's done a lot of the kind of more contemporary research, and it is annotated throughout. It's very, very interesting, but I can't remember his name, so it's no help to any of you. Right, let's start off with Gemma's question. Gemma is age 7. We have a lot of questions, by the way, today about volume. So if you could start researching the volume of the Indian Ocean, this will be very, very useful for one of you to get points before the end. Gemma would like to know... Have you got the answer already, Helen?
I don't hold that number in my head. I'm really sorry, but I can look it up while we're talking.
Okay, don't worry, I'll do it. Oh, and I should also mention, by the way, to everyone, we have other guests today as well. Next week is Hedgehog Awareness Week. We have Hugh Warwick, who's a wonderful, I mean, not merely about hedgehogs, but hedgehogs in particular are one of his loves. And we also have Grace Petrie at the end, who will be singing a song based on a letter that Charles Darwin wrote to his wife, which is a very, very beautiful song. Gemma H7 would like to know, how do your body and organs know how to stop growing? So this is an interesting... So why don't they just keep getting bigger? So I'm going to throw that one to you, Adam. Gemma age 7 wants to know, what's going on?
Well, so there are loads of regulatory... No, let me start that again with a 7-year-old's answer. So the way that our genes are controlled by the environment and what's inside our bodies, inside our cells, the genetic code, how those two things interact is a very, very carefully orchestrated choreography. I sort of dance between what you eat, how you develop, what exercise you're doing, and what is inherent to your genes themselves. And so certain genes get turned on at certain points. So when you start off your life as a single cell, a single fertilized egg, and then a whole program, a sort of network, a cascade of genes kicks in and sets up the whole way that your body will grow from that single cell until you're a fully grown adult. And what that means is that we need certain genes on at certain times, and they get stimulated by the presence of other genes, the structures. So you start off as a single cell, soon you're a ball called a blastocyst, that begins to shape into a sort of banana-like structure. And by that point, we know there's going to be a head and a tail, and at the head, you're going to have a brain and a skull, and at the tail, you're going to have feet and other stuff, and everything else is in the middle. And that is basically how you set up the body plan. And all organisms do this. All animals do it in a very similar way. Even plants do it in a vaguely related way, because a lot of the same genes are involved. And then you get born and you continue to grow until you get to a point where you stop growing, which I guess is what the question is about. And the answer is... Well, I think the answer is, it's a good question. And I was bluffing for a while there, but I think the answer is to do with the onset of sexual maturity. So when we grow up and become, well, we enter adolescence, and then we become adults, and all of the grown-up bits grow, we stop growing at a point where they are all set in place. And those things are regulated by the hormones that we produce, which are both males and females, women and men both produce them, but they are regulated in slightly different ways. And men tend to have much more testosterone than women, which does things like make men more muscular and bulkier on top, but also hairier. And it's also responsible for what's happening to me and you, Robin, at the moment, which is that we're going a bit thin on top. And female hormones such as progesterone enable the growth of things like breasts and the maturation of your ovaries. And all of those things are also involved in regulatory pathways to do with overall growth. I'm still bluffing a little bit.
To be honest, this is why Adam...
Don't all men's ears carry on growing?
And noses.
Yeah, definitely ears, but yeah, possibly noses as well. But get involved in the whole testosterone fandango, or maybe they do.
I think that is a myth, and I think it's to do with the loss of elasticity in molecules like collagen. So ears do tend to get bigger, but they're not actually growing; they're just sagging. In fact, there was a question on
See, I like the fact that you that, Adam. I just
there's a few years ago there was a question on one of the monkey cages about why fingernails and hair continues to grow after we've died. And I remember this because that Brian couldn't answer it and no one on the panel could, but I happen to know what the answer was, which is that they don't continue to grow after death. It's just that everything else continues to shrink. And so what happens is, because nails and hair are not living tissue, they remain the same size. And then when you die, your fingers shrink back and your scalp and the cells at the bottom of your scalp where the hairs are actually held begins to shrink back. So it gives the illusion of your nails growing out and your hair growing, when actually it's just the living tissue that's actually just shrinking.
Well, Gemma, I hope you enjoyed the answer to, not your question, but it was a lovely answer that he came up with for another question. I think he got away with it. Now, of course, in the edit, it would have been perfect, but this is one of the dangers of live. And why, whenever a scientist like Adam says, will you send me the question beforehand, I say, nope, cuts out the fun. Now, Lucy, you were laughing, but I should warn you, your first question is about the platypus. So get ready. This is from Mike B. Would like to know, please explain a platypus. Is it convergent evolution or just randomness and mutations that got well out of hand? So what do you reckon?
Convergent evolution with what? Yeah, okay. No, it's not convergent evolution. No, platypus are fantastically weird. They're one of the monotremes. There's only 2 types of monotreme. You've got your platypus, and then you've got the echidna, which looks a little bit like a hedgehog, but with a long nose. And the 2 of them look completely different and don't look like they belong in a group together. But they do, and they actually have a lot of similarities. One of which is that they lay eggs, which is they're the only mammals that lay eggs, which is fantastic. So platypus obviously famously have this big bill, and they use it to because they hunt at night and in rivers, and they're after crustaceans and things like that, and they've got electrosensors on their bill, and they can snuffle around and they can pick up the electricity of crustacean muscles firing, and that's how they find them, which is amazing. And the echidna has this long pointy snout that it's an anteater, a termite eater, and that stuffs its snout, and similarly that's got electrosensitivity. So they have a lot of weird genetics. And I read something amazing about the platypus's sex chromosomes just the other day. Let me tell you all about it. And Adam may well know this anyway, but so humans have XY system, so females are XX and males are XY. Platypus has 5 X's and 5 Y's. It's like it's got 5 sets of sex chromosomes, and this is one of the kooky links it has with birds, because the monotremes branched off earlier than the placental mammals, and there's something about bird genomes which I'm going to ask Adam about. Is he going to know the answer? I know, because birds have the ZW system, and it's the opposite to us in that males are ZZ and females are ZW, and it's something to do with it's about the load of how much of the Zs or the Ws you have, which make you male or female. Anyway, the platypus basically has the XY system, but it uses the loading thing. Adam would have explained this so much better. But anyway, so they're somewhere in between the 2, and their sex chromosomes tell that story. So no, they're not convergent evolution, but they are genetically very weird.
See, this is interesting because this has shown up, because we've not done that many on biology of the Sunday Q&As, and I think Martin Rees once said something. It was about the complexity of living things and the complexity of a human being versus the complexity of the universe, and how much more complex it is to explain a living thing than it is to explain, in some ways, the universe. And I think we're really underlining that today.
They do have built into them an example, which is that their electrosensors, the mechanism they use is very similar to electrosensing in fish. So when it comes to the actual sensing, like if you want to sense electricity and you're a submerged creature, there's one quite obvious way to do it, which is to have a tube filled with fluid and measure the voltage difference between the ends. And the platypus do the same thing as the fish. So there is at least one electrosensing convergent evolution example.
That is fantastic.
I've got a good platypus story as well, which is more from the history of science, but it agrees with the questioner's, what is going on, the weirdness of the platypus. When the type specimen of the platypus was sent from Australia to what was going to become the Natural History Museum. The scientists who received it, this is I think in the year 1800, the scientists who received it were absolutely convinced that it was a fake, because there was a fashion at the time for sending back fake animals, things like Fiji mermaids, which were being sent back by sailors from the Far East, which would be, hideous things, not like Ariel at all. They were hideous things, sort of desiccated monkeys that had been sewn to the tail of an old fish. And in fact, the great circus impresario P.T. Barnum exhibited one, made an absolute ton of money. I can't remember how much he charged. It was something like a penny to go and see the great Fiji mermaid. And they were a big thing, but scientists recognized that they were clearly hoaxes. So when they received the first platypus back sent from the colonies of Australia to what would become the Natural History Museum, because it wasn't named that yet, they took it apart, thinking that this was ridiculous, that it had been, because it's got these poisonous horns on its back legs, and it's got a bill, and it lays eggs, and it's an absurd creature. So they took it apart and stitched it back together, convinced that it was in fact a real animal. And the holotype, the one that is still in the Natural History Museum, the version of a platypus from which all other platypuses are compared, which is what we do in taxonomy, still has stitch marks on it from where they had to sew it together, because it's quite clearly not something that you'd expect to see at all, because it's an absurd creature.
I'm very sad. My wife's family in North Shields used to have a mermaid. They had exactly that, the desiccated monkey with that, and it was given to a hair salon, but the hair salon closed. No one knows where the mermaid is anymore. So if you've seen a mermaid in the North Shields area, I might have a claim on that. We've got first question for you, Helen. This is we're still on water. This is from Joshua, who would like to know, why does water ruin? He says, why when paper absorbs water then dries, does the paper not go back to its original shape? What is water's effect that causes things to change? So
it's to do with the chemical structure of what makes up paper, which is cellulose. So cellulose are long chain molecules. You can think of them as being a bit like spaghetti, I guess, of long chains, and they tend to sit next to each other, and there are bonds between them. So what happens when you make paper is that you take the cellulose from a tree, effectively, you mush it up, and basically, when you set it, you create, when it dries out, in fact, when water is lost from it, so you do all that while it's wet. And then once the water is lost, each spaghetti strand likes having water around it. But when the water goes away, they'll stick to each other. And so then you've got something that looks like paper. And that's perfectly fine. You've got some paper. And then when you take a paper bag out in the rain, what happens is that water molecules come back, and these bonds, they've got these hydrogen bonds that are very strong, sneak back in between the strands of cellulose. And then there was a bond holding the two cellulose strands together, and now the water sneaked in between, and each of them, the cellulose strands can go off. So they're not attached together anymore, and then the paper falls apart. And what you find is that modern paper has additives in it which make up for that, which sort of act as cross branches that strengthen it in different ways. But basically, that is the basis of paper shaping, and ironing is the same, that you make something wet. And when you make something wet, you add water into spaces. And then whenever you take that water away, it basically, the bits where there was water just join together, and you're left with whatever shape you had when the water was taken away. And so when you iron things, you get it wet. So you add in these extra hydrogen bonds, you dry it out, and then it's basically stuck in that shape until you get it wet again, which is why you can't iron things in humid environments, because water comes in from the atmosphere and fills in the gaps. So that's why someone who's a chemist might make a better job of that explanation.
I've got another explanation for someone who lived in a basement flat which flooded with sewage. I can tell you many details, none of which you want to know, and are reasonably unscientific and quite sweary. 1,000 vinyl albums ruined. Anyway, this is an interesting, which I think both Adam and Lucy might have a take on this, because this is an interesting thing about experience of other animals. And of course, it's a very hard thing to know sometimes in internal experience. Do other animals have taste in the same way that we do, since we're all the same species? Why do we have taste preferences? Example being, why do some people love olives and other people hate them? Are there cows that don't like a particular type of grass? So that is from Jonathan. So that idea of a kind of an individual sense of taste, and indeed animals generally, whether we have an idea that they have taste in the same way that we might experience.
I'm going to let Adam answer, but I'm just going to say the only thing is that apparently penguins can't taste fish.
Oh, that's a very tragic story.
It's just, poor things. Do you know what I mean? But anyway, that's all I really know. Over to Adam.
Well, I suppose it makes them much less picky. If they can't taste fish, they can just eat any fish. So it's like an all-you-can-eat buffet. Anyway, well, yes, the answer is yes, absolutely. Animals do have taste via their olfactory receptors, which is how we smell, which is a big part of taste. Matthew Cobb's the expert on that, but also via the taste receptors that we have on our tongues, which, contrary to many textbooks and humans, are not distributed in nice, neat patterns where you have salt, sweet, sour, bitter, and umami. They're distributed all over your tongue. But there are hundreds of genes involved in taste and smell. And the two things are inherently related to each other. So there's a good experiment that Matthew does to his lectures, which you can do at home if you've got some Skittles or, just a fruity sweet, which is if you you pinch your nose, pop one in your mouth, and you won't be able to taste what flavor it is. You can just taste that it's sweet until you open your nose and then breathe in, and all of a sudden you get the influx of the fruity flavor, the artificial fruity flavor. Anyway, that's us. We have very different tastes. We have a range of taste preferences, which are partially determined by our genes, by just different genetic predispositions towards particular tastes, and is partially generated by what we introduce to children's diets from an early age. Now, when it comes to different animals, I don't know this in a detailed way, but there's no reason to suppose that other animals don't have similar variation in their taste receptors on their tongues. We definitely know that animals such as Lucy's dog and mice and cats have many, many more smell receptors than humans. So, from memory, I think mice have something like 954 different genes which relate specifically to smell, and dogs are something similar. We can actually see the evidence of almost all of those in us as well, but more than half of them have become pseudogenes. So basically we don't use them. We haven't used them over evolutionary time, and they've become redundant. I'm doing that thing again where I'm basically playing for time now.
Can I add in something while you're thinking?
Yes, please.
I am pretty sure that whales can only taste salt, so they've lost all their sweet, sour things. But the salt is very useful in the ocean because salt levels do vary from place to place. So it's possible that they've kept the salt because it lets them know they might be able to navigate using salinity. I don't think anyone's proved that they actually do that. But if you had one of those in the ocean and you were going to pick the most useful one of the five that we have, salt, sweet, sour, whatever the others, umami, you would pick salt because it does let you navigate. So, and they think it's because whales didn't use it. So the mutations accumulated in all the others, and there was no selection, so they lost them.
Well, that gave you some time, Adam, but I'm not expecting a conclusion. As we know, biology is a long way to go. Lucy, we've had a question for you, which is, in making your television programs, what animal has it been revealed that you no longer? So, have you ever? This is from another Lucy, and she wanted to know: have you found through investigation there was an animal you were previously
no longer are? Humans. Gosh. I don't know. No, I don't think so. I can't think of anything. I mean, no, I don't think so. I mean, it's fascinating. Even sort of, I really like weird, ugly, strange animals. So, and some animals are sort of not what you think that they are purported to be, and so one might be disappointed, for instance, if one's really fond of penguins and thinks that they're adorable, lovable creatures because of their wibbly wobbly way that they walk, to find out that they're basically pathologically unpleasant necrophiliacs. That might disappoint some people, but on the other hand, I find that quite thrilling and exciting. So I've yet to find an animal that I don't really like. Although some of the really bitey big centipede things I've come across, actually, they're not very nice. And mosquitoes are always pretty unwelcome now I think about it. But particularly the one that gave me dengue fever. But and I've got another one now. Yes, yes, the bullet ant. The bullet ant, which is to this guy at Arizona University, and I would love to get drunk with him, or at least just spend an evening listening to his tales. Who's graded the
supposed to be frozen.
He recognised the fact that there needed to be. He recognised that there was no sort of standard. If people went, oh yeah, no, it was very painful, and somebody else went, yeah, it was very painful. That one person needed to have been stung by them all in order to be able to grade which was the most painful of them all. And so he did this, and he's written this guide, and it reads very much like I don't know, it's like a sort of florid kind of wine. The descriptions are like, oh, such and such is like a fine paper cut in an acid bath, or so he's sort of really gone to town over the descriptions. But number one is the bullet ant, and so called because it allegedly feels like you've been shot by a bullet. And I was running through the jungle once chasing monkeys, and one fell in my bra. Yeah.
Because I think Steve Backshall did some kind of on one of his shows, because there is a rite of passage, isn't there? A tribal rite of passage where you have to become a man, you have to go through this process of all these bullet ants. And I think Steve Backshall, for some reason, did that. And I still think he preferred that to doing Strictly, though. From what I can gather, I still think he found the Paso Doble more troublesome than the pain of bullet ants. Yes, Adam, you have your hand up.
Well, I do have one, and I think it's an interesting question in that what Lucy said is absolutely right. The animal, when we think about nature, we anthropomorphize them. We think about them in human terms. We think about their behaviors without really understanding the thought processes behind them, other than trying to understand it from an evolutionary point of view, which is, am I going to eat you, or am I going to reproduce with you, or are you trying to eat me? But followers of my work will know that in the writing of my last book, the Book of Humans, where I wrote a lot about some of the more deviant behavior of various animals, there were a couple of species whose behavior is somewhat unpalatable and probably not really a Sunday afternoon conversation to have. But I've already said that I wouldn't talk about the sea otters because, well, you can just look it up. But the other one that tipped over from being, wow, that's an interesting and fairly revolting set of behaviors, into, dude, you guys are really, really just assholes, which is bottlenose dolphins. So cute, so intelligent, do so many things, have nice smiley faces that make us think that they're a bit human-like. And some of their behavior is well, it's very reminiscent of the worst aspects of human behavior. So a lot of it is to do with how they reproduce, and I won't go into that, but also just straight up infanticide. So killing babies for reasons that we don't really understand. Lots of other mammals kill babies in ways that we do understand. So, for example, lions will, male lions will kill the babies of a female if they know that they haven't been sired by them. And interestingly, leopards have got round this, but the females have sex with multiple males, and so the males then don't know whether the individual babies are theirs or another male's. But males, two males will go around. They'll go to a female and find a set of babies that they know aren't their own, and will eat them, and then they will attempt to reproduce with that female. Now that's a good evolutionary reason. We understand why they would do that. We don't know why the dolphins do it, but I think it was I've got the proper reference for it up on that shelf. But in the 90s, there was a report of something like 30-odd young bottlenose dolphins that washed up on a beach having been bitten and bashed to death by elder bottlenose dolphins. They're just horrible creatures.
I still find when ever reading Jane Goodall or watching Jane Goodall lectures, when she talks about the first observation of cannibalism amongst chimpanzees, is such a kind of. I was chatting to a friend of mine who looks after gorillas, and she said there was a moment once where one of the baby gorillas had been probably killed by a male that had been introduced, and the first time that they allowed the females to gather, so there was this moment where they were all watching, just thinking that the baby is going to be discovered, and one female gorilla in particular went over and bent over, and they were watching this, anthropomorphizing all the time the beauty of this love. And then eventually they realized actually just behind the baby was also an orange, which seemed to be slightly stuck. So the actual fascination and the mourning was not mourning as, how am I going to get that orange? So again, it's an interesting thing how we anthropomorphize quite a lot. This is one for you. Oh, sorry.
Understanding that, and you'd have to check with a proper primatologist, someone like Kat Hoberter or Ben Garrett might know, but I believe that we've never actually seen a chimpanzee give birth in the wild, despite all of the amazing work of people like Diane Fossey and those primatologists and Jane Goodall. It's an act which is done in intense privacy by females in little nests covered by leaves. And we think that one of the reasons it is such an act of intense privacy is because we have observed newborn babies being stolen and eaten. And so we've seen that, not often, but it is a recorded, it's an event which has been published in the literature. And again, it's an example of infanticide, possibly to prevent another male from siring an offspring. So as soon as the baby is born, it's whipped away and they eat it. Nature is lovely.
But it's good. I think the great thing about the amount of research into all these areas is quite often we still read in books, what is it that makes humans so brutal? Why are humans so awful? And you go, if you spend long enough and you really examine what goes on in so many different animal cultures, if you want to call it that, it turns out it's not all just moving pianos up the stairs before a cup of tea. So this is a question for Helen from James. James would like to know, why do we see rainbows as distinct bands of colour rather than a continuous changing?
Oh, this is a good question because it exactly highlights how humans interpret things. So we don't. It is a continuous spectrum of colour. We don't see individual bands. And in fact, there was quite a lot of argument early on in the history of scientists studying colour about how many colours there are, and different cultures split it up into a different number. And the reason we ended up with 7 is that Isaac Newton was terribly keen on things having the right number. And so the distinction between indigo and violet is a sort of made up one, because no one will ever claim to have seen indigo in a rainbow, but it meant there were the right number of colours, which is 7. So there is a continuous spectrum of colours, just as the wavelength gradually gets longer and longer. And in fact, off either end of the rainbow, there are colours we can't see. So it carries on. So we only see a narrow band, and that the rainbow doesn't contain all the colours we can see, because there are combinations of those wavelengths that give us new colours that are not in the rainbow itself. So effectively, that division into separate colours is entirely cultural. That's a decision. We have all learnt to expect to see red and orange and yellow and green. But in reality, different cultures put those boundaries in different places. And one of the things that bothers people most is the question of whether the red that you see is the same as the red that I see. I think we had this discussion last week. And it really bothers people if it's not the same. But actually, we do interpret colours quite differently. So, yeah, it's all interpretation. It's not physics.
We just had, by the way, Jasper in the live chat has sent a message about that question about animals and the experience of taste. Jasper has worked with koalas. And some definitely appear to have preferences. Nothing more frustrating than going out collecting branches only to have the koala decide, no, I don't like that species. So that's interesting. It's one more question, and then we're going to go over to Adam. You have your hand up. Yes.
It's like school, isn't it? No, just my other show and tell, which again was something I just yanked off the wall just before the show, is directly relevant to what Helen was just saying. And this is one of my prized possessions, which is, if you can see this, this is the front page of the Times, page 2 of the Times newspaper from 1703. It's also upside down. It would help if I did that. From 1703. And this whole column here is adverts. So there is personal announcements. There's a couple of references to people who have, there's I like this one particularly. Thomas Holland was sent on the 23rd of April by his master, John Sewell, basically an escaped enslaved person. He was asking for him to return. But anyway, that's not the point. The point is, and the reason I own this is because the second one down is the announcement of the publication of Optics, which is the book, but obviously I cannot afford the original of that, but I can afford the advert in the newspaper. And if you can just see, it says Optics, or a treatise on the reflections, refractions, and inflections and colours of light by Mr. Isaac Newton, printed for S. Smith and B. Walford in the Prime Annis of St. Paul's Churchyard.
Yeah, just about. Yeah, it's lovely. But mainly we were seeing reflections of ourselves, which we're all enjoying as well, narcissistically. But I loved it the other day. My dad turned 90 2 weeks ago, so we had to do over Skype. We did a family quiz of 91 questions, and I looked up the day that he was born, and the news on the BBC that day. The BBC News began with, "There has been no news today," and then there was 15 minutes of piano. Wonderful. We got one more question. This is just a quick one. Just see if you have looked this up, and then hopefully we'll be able to come back. We've got some stuff about hippopotamus, the hippopotamus. So I hope we're going to be able to go to that after we've had our chat about hedgehogs. But this is from Jeremy's 8-year-old, who's a budding paleontologist, and he wants to know, Helen, the volume of water.
So I have, I did cheat. I looked it up, and it is 264 million cubic kilometers. And the Indian Ocean is it's the one that gets forgotten. I think it's always been a bit undersold because everyone thinks about the Atlantic and the Pacific, and Western explorers tended just to go around the edges of the Indian Ocean and not bother very much about the middle. So it is 20% of the volume of the entire ocean. It's almost all 4 kilometers deep. It's a very deep ocean, and it does have hundreds of millions of cubic kilometers. Did I say square? Cubic kilometers of water in it. So there's a lot of the Indian Ocean.
Right, so there's a lot of work for you for Jeremy's 8-year-old paleontologist. We'll hopefully come back to you before the end of the show. Thank you very much, everyone, for the time being. And just a reminder, don't forget that we have the tip jar at the bottom so that we can try and make sure this is free access. But if you are still doing okay at the moment, then that money gets used as a resource for artists and art centres, and also a resource for us to make as many things as possible. So Lucy, Adam, Helen, we'll see you again shortly. Now, please welcome, as I said, I promised you hedgehogs. There are hedgehogs. Here is Hugh Warwick. Hello Hugh.
Hello,
now,
Robin.
This is. Let's just get this straight. Though it's Hedgehog Awareness Week, starting on Monday.
Starting today. No. This is it. This is like the lead event. This is what we've been waiting for the entire year. For this one moment with you and me, viewers. Hedgehog Awareness Week is now officially launched.
I'm so annoyed because I've not been aware enough of them. I was going to be so aware from now. Why do we need a Hedgehog Awareness Week?
Well, when the British Hedgehog Preservation Society was formed back in 1982, there was much less attention paid to hedgehogs. So it was like, let's do loads and loads of things for hedgehogs. Now, actually, we've managed to raise the profile of hedgehogs. We've managed to get the awareness about the population decline of hedgehogs into the press. We can't really go anywhere without hedgehog stories. In fact, only last week, we had an entire string of press pieces, and I was doing radio interviews about amorous hedgehogs having more sex in people's gardens because of the virus. I think it's just more the fact that more people were spending time in their gardens out at night, looking out there just in a sense of absolute depression and going, oh my God, hedgehogs. So I think probably more to do with observational bias than to do with actual increased nookie. So the real reason, though, is that it's our nation's favourite animal. Everyone loves the hedgehog, yet probably, at a bit of a guess, we've lost between 90 and 95% of the hedgehogs in this country since the end of the Second World War. And certainly we know with some robustness that it's down by 30% in urban areas, and down by 50% in rural areas in the last 20 years. So there are really, really big problems. And so we do this. We spend a week of jollity, frivolity. I'm doing all sorts of live streams. I've got one of my lectures is up online with the Hedgehog Society. And we are having, a week dedicated to the hedgehog. Normally, I'm out in primary schools and at the Women's Institute groups. But no, I'm in my cabin.
Now, can I ask? This is 2 days ago. My dad found a hedgehog on his step, and he wondered what is the best thing to do if you do find a hedgehog very close to your house, maybe, you know, kind of on a concrete step. Is there anything, should you move the hedgehog? Should you take it anywhere? And if you are going to move it, I think it's true, isn't it? If you just kind of brush it, it will go into a ball, and it doesn't hurt, does it? But should that be done?
Okay, the first thing depends on the time of day. On the whole, you see a hedgehog, the first thing you should do is just generally feel a great sense of joy, because it is such a delightful thing. Yes, you can stroke a happy hedgehog. In fact, I happen to have a happy hedgehog here. I mean, it's maybe, as it were, those wonderful hedgehog fjords. But the happy hedgehogs, yes, stroke one of those. Don't interfere with hedgehogs unless you really need to. Now, if a hedgehog's out in the daytime, looking a bit peaky, you'll notice one thing: hedgehogs nocturnal. If they're sunbathing, something's really wrong. If they're looking a bit drunk, something's a bit wrong. So then you can intervene, pick them up, put them in a box. You get in touch with the British Hedgehog Preservation Society, all sorts of social media channels. They've got a phone number, and that will lead you through to all of the different hedgehog carers around the country. They can give you top advice. If the hedgehog's out at night, yes, just sit and pause. And if you're really lucky, you can get kind of nose to nose with it, because the hedgehog is blessed with no fight or flight response. So this, when people ask me, why do I study hedgehogs, is a really, really simple answer. They don't run away, they don't bite you, and so therefore much easier to work with. And so you can get nose to nose with this creature, and then you will be nose to nose with an animal which is bigger than 99% of all animals that have ever lived on the planet. It's in the top 1% with the blue whale, Tyrannosaurus rex, and us. You know, it's a pretty extraordinary thing to be able to get close to. It's a fantastic, wonderfully evolved, terrifying predator, if you're a slug.
So that's the lack of a fight or flight response. Is that basically because it has evolved to have the protection of the spikes, that therefore it doesn't need to go anywhere? It just needs to go, no, you can't have me. It will be too painful to consume. I mean, is that part of what we can kind of read into its lack of fight or flight?
No, completely. I mean, the only other animal which has a lot of the same is the common toad, well, the toads, because they don't have prickles on the back, but they've got this sort of fantastic pharmacy on their backs, which will spray out horrible chemicals. But no, it's simple as that. The hedgehog has made this compromise. Okay, so you've got a furry rabbit. They're well insulated. They can cope with the rigors of winter. The hedgehog went with prickles. All it is modified hair, same stuff, keratin. So when a hedgehog dies, it just looks like the spines grow longer. And they're not as well insulated, therefore they have to hibernate. But no, they don't have a fight or flight response, because the first thing a hedgehog does when it's bothered is it frowns at you. When you frown, you may get a few wrinkles depending on your regime. But the frown muscle on a hedgehog goes all the way from its nose down to its tail, brings the spines up into a prickly bundle. And then if it's really upset, it rolls into a ball.
Now, what is it? Where does your fascination come from? Because this is, I know obviously there's a lot of the natural world that you are interested in, but it is that the hedgehog over the last 10 years, certainly the time that I've known of your work, the hedgehog is, you know, something that you have an extra, it seems a little bit extra for in terms of love.
Well, okay, so yeah, love you. Yes, there is the love thing. There's a really, really lovely part of it. But partly it's because people love hedgehogs. Okay, every time there's a vote or a poll, the hedgehog wins. And that's a really fantastic thing. The most nation's favourite animal in every single respect. Favourite organism, favourite nature icon. And this means that I can then have a conversation with people about habitat fragmentation, or the way that we produce our food, or the way that our transport network is established, or the way developers work. I can do all of these things because people will start listening, because it's about hedgehogs. So I've just launched a petition at the moment with change.org, been running for over a year now, and we're nearly at 700,000 signatories. And it's change.org /save our hedgehogs. All we're doing is looking for the very simplest, smallest thing, new developments. Let's have holes in the bottom of fences to let hedgehogs get into the gardens. This isn't just going to be helping hedgehogs, it's helping the whole suite of our wildlife. All the stuff which doesn't have the ability to fly, obviously. So yeah, I love hedgehogs because they don't bite, they don't run away, they're beautiful animals to look at, but also because they're a gateway species into talking about a whole bunch of other environmental problems.
When do you think that the realization? Because you also mentioned toads there, and I remember when I was that's a very loud toad we've got just from off there. But when I mentioned when you mentioned toads, where I grew up in the countryside, there was a toad crossing. There never used to be, but they actually started to put up signs which were talking about the time when towards the river there would be a lot of toads moving, and for people to be more careful. And that seemed to be, when did we start to get the realization of sometimes this sense of destruction, whether hedgehogs, toads, etc.?
Society was back in 1982, and that was Major Adrian Coles noticing hedgehogs dead in cattle grids. And he like, oh, put a brick inside the cattle grid, let the hedgehog climb up. Now you can get ramps inside it. Frog Life was set up. Charity, similarly, they do the Toads on Roads patrol. And you're absolutely right. Toads are migrating into their ancestral ponds to reproduce, because they tend not to live in the ponds. They live out in the wilds, as it were, or our gardens. But our road has appeared, and these anurans, which have been around for millions of years, that's like a sudden change in their lives. They're not going to stop using the road to cross. Interestingly, a lot of the signs put up about toads, road signs, are there to alert motorists of skid risks rather than for us to be concerned about the toads. The Department of Transport has announced that there's going to be hedgehog signs out there now. That is actually to benefit the hedgehogs rather than for any other risk. So we have started to care more about these animals than when we've learnt more about them. We begin to really, really care because we've got that the science is being done. People care less about hedgehogs probably when they thought they were very abundant. But now we know these population declines are really serious. It means that the Hedgehog Street campaign that we run with the People's Trust for Endangered Species is absolutely flooded with people going and making holes in their fences. So the transformation has come from knowledge, I think.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Hugh. And can we activities that people can get involved with? You kind of what should people be doing this week? What to make sure they're engaged? Because a lot of people homeschooling, so it would be nice to think of certain projects they might be able to do as well.
Well, lots of information on the British Hedgehog Preservation Society website, so go there for top tips. There's quizzes being run every single day with loads of great prizes. Also have a think about your garden if you're lucky enough to have a garden. Just basically get rid of the cult of tidiness. Don't do quite so much tidiness around there. Make sure there's a hole in your fence so the hedgehogs can get in. Make sure your garden's not too tidy, and go to the Hedgehog Society for loads of other top tips. Just quickly, I wanted to go back to a question that was presented to Adam about the growth of people, the growth of bodies, the growth of when do we stop? Surely it's all down to the hedgehog gene. Isn't that the thing which is actually controlling it all? I was really thinking this was like the most brilliantly serendipitous link joining us all together. We have the echidnas and we have the hedgehog gene as well. So is the hedgehog gene part of the story? Is that something we can hear yet?
Adam?
Am I back on? Yes. Yeah. Well, do you know what, Hugh? That was masterful. I'm embarrassed that I didn't manage to do that. So hedgehog was a gene that I worked on for my undergraduate project. And the reason it's called that is because many of the gene names get named after when mutations in those genes are discovered, mostly in fruit flies. And in fruit flies, we have the liberty of observing, really quite disturbing peculiar mutations. So hedgehog was discovered because it got spikes all over its thorax. So when this gene was mutated, it got spikes all over its thorax, which meant that they could identify the gene. So the fly biologists call it hedgehog. And it's a really important developmental gene. So what that means is it's active during the time when an animal is an embryo, and it's in pretty much all animal species. There are different versions of the gene, and one of them is slightly different, has a slightly different effect, and the very nice, clever fly biologists decided to call it sonic hedgehog as a result. So sonic hedgehog is one of the actual genes that exists in lots of different animals. Unfortunately, human biologists are really bad at naming things and really boring. We have to introduce a load of really rigorously kept rules about our gene names. And so sonic hedgehog in humans is called SHH, which some people know stands for sonic hedgehog, but it's never referred to as that. But the fly biologists, they have all the fun. They've got tons of crazy names like Sonic, like Wingless. I worked on a gene called Aristolus because the ends of its feet didn't grow. But they all get turned into really boring names in animals and mice. So sorry about that. Stick to flies. Much more exciting.
Brilliant. Liz wanted to know, have you seen the footage of fish being caught using Mentos and Coca-Cola?
No, I haven't, but I'm going to Google it as soon as this is over.
It is. Have you seen it, Helen? Looking at your reaction,
I'm not sure we should encourage
That's what I mean. This is
fishing, right? It wrecked Jamaica's coral reefs because people were like, "Oh, we'll lob a bomb out there, blow everything up, and loads of fish float to the surface." So Coke and Mentos is it works. I have some Mentos somewhere. If I'd known, I would have got them out to demonstrate. But it's definitely, I can see it being very bad for fish. Probably not good for the environment.
Well, that's what I thought. It looked very disturbing because it seems to be that the stuff I've seen is on dried floodplains, as far as I can see. So it's fish now that are in areas of water below there, and it's just pouring the Coca-Cola into a hole. Put it anyway. Don't do it. That's what I wanted to know. I found it tremendously
way
disturbing.
for the fish to die. I think I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm keen on this as a fishing method.
It's an unpleasant way for humans to die, but many will also die from similar. But that's due to addiction as opposed to forced Coca-Cola, depending on how you view the nature of the advertising industry. Thank you all very much. I will remind you of the person. I always do. The person who's got the most recent book, Adam Rutherford's book, How to Argue with the Racist, is a very good and very useful book. And don't forget Lucy's Truth About Animals. She's working on another book, as is Helen, whose current book is Storm in a Teacup. And Hugh, you have various. What's your most recent book?
Linescapes, all about habitat fragmentation.
Oh, I've not read that yet, but I have. Given it to my dad, so he'll review it, and then if he passes it on to me, you've passed the test. Thank you all very much. We're now going to go over and see Grace Petrie. We're going to be back also our next Sunday, as well as I said, Monday tomorrow. If you've got any questions about psychology, the illusion of self, why we hoard, all of those different things, we've got Bruce Hood on tomorrow, and we also have Laura Kidd, who used to be She Makes War, but now has a new outfit, which is Pen Friend. So thank you very much for joining us. I'm now going to go over to Grace. Hello, Grace Petrie. Hopefully you are there or about to be there.
I hope I'm here.
There we are. Yes, you're in my ears, which is the main thing. Hello. Now.
Hello.
You have obviously we've done a few shows together. Many other shows on this course, touring around and had a lot of fun. But this was This was you. You normally used to introduce this song, making me to be a patriarchal oppressor who forced you to write songs about scientists and their lives.
Yeah. Well, it's been ever since I've known you. It's been nothing but oppression, Robin. I think you're well aware of this. I find you a very, very oppressive figure in my life. No. Well, so hello everybody watching out there at home. Robin very, very kindly asked me to be a guest on a science night that he was doing all about Charles Darwin. And because I am not, whenever we do these wonderful shows and I get invited to come along because Robin and I are mates and he's very good at giving me gigs and giving me work. But I always feel like the absolute sort of imposter in the green room because I don't know anything about science. I'm not very scientifically minded. And Robin said to me a few years ago, do you think you could write a song about Charles Darwin? And I foolishly said, yeah, I'm sure I can. And then I did a little bit of Wikipedia standard looking through the kind of reading up about Charles Darwin, as who he was as an actual person. And I found it all a little bit dry. I found there wasn't really much that I could sort of get a hook on to write a song about. And then I started reading more about his family life. And I found on Letters of Note, I found this wonderful letter that his wife Emma had written to him. And if there's time, Robin, I'm just going to read a little bit of it, if that's all right. So basically, it was while Charles Darwin was in the process of sort of coming up with the origin of the species theory, and essentially in doing so, he was sort of losing his faith, his idea in a great creator. And at the time, obviously that was very unusual. And there's this wonderful letter that Emma Darwin wrote to him, and it's quite sort of wordy. The language is quite thick, and I was reading through it trying to find the kind of kernel of the human story in it. And there's just a line in it that says, everything that concerns you concerns me, and I should be most unhappy if I thought that we did not belong to each other forever. And I think that's really lovely. And the letter is on Letters of Note, and there's just a postscript that Charles Darwin wrote to his wife that just said, when I am dead, know that many times I have kissed and cried over this. And I thought, there's the guy. I can write a song about that. So, you getting that guitar there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll just quickly mention, because this is the last
Grace's
thing
work.
She's recorded a lot of excellent albums. In fact, I did my first Spotify playlist the other day of people that I first saw at a festival and have then been addicted to their music ever since. And I stuck on that Iago, which is one of my first favourite songs of yours, because it's such a very, very beautiful song. And I highly recommend I'm sure many of you know Grace's work anyway, and you will have seen her either on her own or supporting Frank Turner or lots of other stuff. But go and find her work, buy her work, because so many artists can't go out and they can't play at the moment, and you will not be disappointed by her wonderful work. So the final thing for today, and also if you can, there's a tip jar at the bottom of this. Follow us on YouTube and via Patreon and all those things. But ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to another corner of her house. We've seen so many corners of your house in the last few weeks. Here's another corner. Grace Petrie.
A mind of untold history, a journey round the world. So one heart just your Charlie, forever to my girl. The ever-growing beauty of everything I see is I belong to you, love, and you belong to me. And love, and love. When I'm dead and all this, many times I've kissed and cried over this, and cried over this. When I'm dead and all this, many times I've kissed and cried over this, and cried over this. The oceans that divide us, of distance and of faith. I worry for our one life, you worry that I'm safe. The burden of discovery that nearly took me home, and left you who has my heart now to worry for my soul. And love, and love. When I'm dead and all this, I've kissed and cried over this, and cried over this. When I'm dead and all this, many times I've kissed and cried over this, and cried over this. My heart has known its one love, of that being no doubt. One life, this life was enough. You made each second count.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.